The room is too quiet for a man who once commanded entire theaters with nothing but his voice. On the small wooden table near the window lies an old script, its edges softened by years of handling. The ink has faded in places, but certain lines are still underlined, bold strokes from a time when the words mattered urgently. A single lamp throws a muted glow across the pages. Outside, late afternoon light spills through thin curtains, painting long shadows across the floor. A man sits by the window, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped. He is not reading. He is not rehearsing. He is simply staring out, as if the world beyond the glass has become distant, almost abstract. His shoulders are broader than they once were, but they curve forward now, slightly, as though carrying something unseen. He shifts in his chair, not dramatically, just enough to betray discomfort. A small, almost private movement. It is difficult to reconcile this stillness with the thunderous applause that once followed him wherever he went. There was a time when his entrance alone could electrify a stage. Audiences would lean forward, anticipating the first line. Directors trusted him with their most complex roles. Producers built productions around his presence. He wasn't just performing characters, he inhabited them, gave them bone and breath. Television screens across South Africa flickered with his face. Theaters filled because his name was on the poster. Only after a few moments does the truth settle in. The man in that quiet room is Sello Maake Ka-Ncube. He is now 65, and the silence around him feels heavier than it should. Age, of course, is not an enemy by default. 65 can still be vibrant, even defiant. But time has a way of making negotiations with the body that no amount of talent can override. In recent months, those close to him have noticed what he does not openly discuss. The slower rise from a chair. The hand that lingers against a wall for balance. The long pauses between sentences when fatigue sneaks in uninvited. He does not dramatize it. That is not his style. But the body has been less cooperative. Persistent aches that once could be dismissed as just a bad day now stretch into weeks. A weariness that seeps deeper than simple exhaustion. There are days when even rehearsing alone feels like climbing an unseen hill. Doctors' appointments have quietly replaced late-night rehearsals. Medication bottles line the kitchen shelf with an orderliness that feels too deliberate. He does not speak of it publicly in detail. He has always guarded his private battles. And yet, those who look closely can see the shift. The man who once moved with an actor's controlled precision now conserves his energy carefully. Conversations are shorter. Public appearances are less frequent. When he smiles, it still carries warmth. But there is something else underneath. A flicker of calculation, perhaps, as if measuring how much strength he has left for the rest of the day. What makes it harder, perhaps, is the contrast. Because the industry still remembers him in motion, projecting, commanding, unbreakable. The younger generation studies his performances in archives and interviews. They see the confident posture, the booming voice, the effortless transformation from role to role. They do not see the quiet mornings when his joints resist him. They do not see the way he sometimes remains seated longer than necessary, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass. There is no scandal here, no explosive revelation, just the slow, undeniable reality that even legends must eventually negotiate with their own limits. Friends say he tries to remain optimistic. He speaks about gratitude, about resilience, about faith. But there are moments, fleeting, unguarded, when the weight shows. A hesitation before climbing stairs, a subtle tightening of the jaw when pain flares unexpectedly. The script on the table is not merely nostalgia. It is a reminder of who he has been, and perhaps a quiet question about who he is allowed to be now. He still loves the craft. That much is clear. The fire has not gone out. It flickers differently, yes, but it remains. Yet the body no longer answers every creative impulse with enthusiasm. It negotiates. It delays. It demands rest when the mind wants to continue. And in that negotiation lies a private sorrow. Not the dramatic sorrow of headlines or farewell speeches. Something quieter, more stubborn. The kind that settles in when a man who once filled vast spaces with his presence must now measure his steps inside a single room. He does not say he is afraid. He does not say he is defeated. But when he sits by that window, staring at nothing in particular, there is a stillness that feels almost foreign to the man he used to be. The applause has faded into memory. The lights have dimmed. What remains is a body that insists on reminding him, daily, that time has its own script. And unlike the ones on the table, this script does not come with rehearsals. There was a time when silence only existed because he demanded it. Long before the quiet room and the careful movements, there were nights when theaters trembled under the weight of applause. His name alone could fill seats. Producers knew it. Audiences trusted it. And when he stepped onto a stage, there was no uncertainty about who commanded the space. Sello Maake Ka-Ncube did not simply perform roles, he occupied them. On television, his presence carried authority. Viewers across South Africa grew accustomed to that unmistakable voice. Deep, measured, resonant. It wasn't loud for the sake of being heard. It didn't need to be. His voice had gravity. When he delivered a line, it settled into a room like something solid. Even in silence, he held attention. On stage, the effect was even more profound. There are still people who remember those performances not as entertainment, but as experiences. He stood beneath blinding theater lights, shoulders squared, posture unshakable. His gestures were deliberate, his pauses intentional. He understood rhythm, not just in dialogue, but in breathing, in stillness, in tension. A raised eyebrow from him could shift the emotional temperature of an entire scene. He played kings, fathers, rebels, men torn by history and pride. And when he embodied those characters, you believed him. His eyes carried weight, an intensity that suggested stories far beyond the script. It wasn't just acting. It felt lived in, personal, dangerous at times. You could sense strength in him then. Not just physical strength, though that was there too, the firm stride, the confident stance, but an internal steadiness. He seemed anchored, grounded, as though nothing could easily unsettle him. Audiences respected him in a way that goes beyond admiration. There was reverence. In South Africa, where storytelling holds deep cultural roots, he became part of that lineage, a bridge between stage and screen, between tradition and modern narrative. Younger actors studied his discipline. Directors relied on his instinct. His peers spoke of him not just as talented, but formidable. He carried himself like a man who understood his worth. That warm baritone voice once filled television studios and theater halls alike. It carried grief, rage, tenderness, authority, sometimes all within a single monologue. And when he laughed, it had a richness to it. When he argued in character, it felt dangerous. When he fell silent, audiences leaned forward, waiting. There were award ceremonies where he stood beneath bright chandeliers, applause swelling around him. There were interviews where journalists struggled to keep up with the depth of his reflection. There were standing ovations that seemed to stretch endlessly, curtains rising again and again because the crowd refused to let him leave. He was, unmistakably, at the center of it, a strong man, a commanding presence, a figure framed by light. And perhaps that is what makes the contrast so stark now. Because the memory of that man still exists, archived in recordings, preserved in photographs, echoed in testimonials. But the body that once strode confidently across polished stages now moves with more calculation. The voice that once projected effortlessly across large halls now rests more often. Not because the talent has diminished, but because stamina no longer arrives without negotiation. There is something quietly unsettling about witnessing such transformation. The public still sees the legend. They remember the powerful performances, the unwavering posture, the depth in his gaze. But the reality behind closed doors tells a more complicated story. Strength, once taken for granted, now feels fragile at times. Energy, once abundant, must be rationed. Appearances are carefully chosen. Commitments weighed against physical cost. It is not that the fire has disappeared. It hasn't. But it burns differently? Where once he stood beneath harsh stage lights without hesitation, now even bright daylight can feel exhausting. Where once rehearsals ran late into the night, now rest is not optional, it is necessary. The powerful voice remains, but it emerges more selectively, as though aware of its own limits. And still, the legacy does not fade. Young actors still mention his name with respect. Old fans still recount scenes they remember vividly. In conversations about South African theatre and television, his contributions are not footnotes. They are chapters. Entire eras can be traced through his performances. Yet there is an irony in legacy. The brighter the past, the more noticeable the dimming feels. To have once stood at the center of roaring applause and now sit in measured quiet requires a particular kind of resilience. Not the resilience of battling critics or surviving industry politics, but the resilience of confronting one's own body, of accepting that the man who once seemed unbreakable must now acknowledge fragility. And perhaps that is the most difficult role of all. Because when a man has lived so vividly in the light, when he has been defined by strength, by presence, by command, the slow retreat into physical limitation is not just biological, it is psychological. It reshapes identity. He was once the man under the spotlight, gaze steady, voice unwavering. Now, the spotlight exists mostly in memory, and the man who once filled entire rooms must learn how to live inside smaller, quieter spaces, carrying with him the echo of applause that, even today, refuses to completely disappear. 65 is not supposed to sound like surrender, and yet, for Sello Maake Ka-Ncube, it has become a number that quietly rearranges the rhythm of his days. There is no dramatic announcement, no headline declaring a diagnosis, no public confession of a grave illness. What exists instead is something subtler, more human. A body that no longer responds the way it once did. A strength that now comes in measured portions. A resilience that requires negotiation. The aches began gradually. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A stiffness in the morning. A dull throb after standing too long. The kind of discomfort any man in his 60s might wave away with a half-smile and a joke about getting older. But what was once occasional has become more persistent. The soreness lingers. The joints protest longer. Recovery, once swift and unnoticed, now stretches into days. He does not dramatize it, he does not complain publicly. But those close to him can see the adjustments. He rises from his seat more carefully now. There is a pause before he straightens fully, as though testing whether his body will cooperate. He no longer moves with the same fluid certainty that once defined him on stage. Each step is deliberate, not fragile, but cautious. Fatigue has become an uninvited companion, not the kind of tiredness that disappears after a good night's sleep. This is deeper. A heaviness that settles in the muscles, in the bones. There are mornings when the energy simply does not arrive on schedule. Days when concentration drifts sooner than it used to. Even conversations can feel longer than expected. He has learned to conserve himself. Public appearances have grown less frequent. Invitations that once would have been accepted without hesitation are now considered carefully. Travel, especially, requires more thought. Long hours under bright lights or in crowded venues take a toll that lingers afterward. He still shows up when he can, but he chooses his moments more selectively. To some, it may appear as withdrawal, but it is not retreat, it is adaptation. When he walks into a room now, the presence is still there, but it moves at a slower tempo. The strong posture remains, though softened by time. His gaze, once sharp and piercing in performance, carries a different depth. There is reflection in it, a kind of quiet calculation, as though he is measuring not only the space around him, but the strength within him. His eyes seem heavier sometimes, not defeated, just aware that the body has limits. There is something humbling about that realization. For a man who once embodied power so convincingly, who portrayed characters that defied fear and commanded authority, the shift can feel almost ironic. Strength was part of his identity, not only on screen, but in the way he moved through the world. And now, that strength must be rationed. Healing takes longer. A minor strain lingers. A restless night leaves traces well into the following day. He listens to his body more closely than he ever did before. Where once he might have pushed through discomfort, he now pauses. Rest is no longer optional. It is necessary. Still, there is no public declaration of illness. No confirmed diagnosis. No dramatic revelation. Just the undeniable sense that things are not as they used to be. Fans who see him today may notice small changes. The slower stride. The measured gestures. The way he sometimes sits rather than stands during longer engagements. His voice still carries warmth, but it does not surge with the same effortless force as before. It rises when needed, but it no longer lives at that height constantly. And perhaps the most visible change is in the quiet moments, when he is not speaking, when he is not performing, when he believes no one is watching. There is a stillness there, deeper than before. A contemplation that wasn't as present in his younger years. Age has not erased his dignity, but it has introduced introspection. He seems more aware of time, more protective of his energy, more careful with his commitments. It raises a difficult question. What does it mean for a man once defined by strength to accept the limits of his own body? For someone who stood under harsh stage lights without flinching, who carried demanding roles with confidence, what internal conversation must take place when fatigue becomes familiar? When pain lingers? When recovery is no longer automatic? There is no shame in aging, and yet, for those who have lived so visibly in their prime, the contrast can feel sharp. He does not appear broken. He does not appear defeated. But he does appear changed, and change, when it involves the body, is rarely simple. It challenges identity. It forces patience. It requires humility, especially for someone who has spent decades being perceived as powerful. At 65, Sello Maake Ka-Ncube is not the man he was at 40 or 50. He is slower, more deliberate, quieter in certain ways. His health is not what it once was. Not catastrophic, not publicly alarming, just not as strong. And perhaps that subtle shift, the absence of former vitality rather than the presence of dramatic illness, is what feels most unsettling. Because it does not announce itself loudly, it simply settles in, gradually reshaping the rhythm of a life that once moved at full force. The applause may still echo in memory, but the body now writes its own tempo. There was a period when his calendar barely had space to breathe. Back then, days were mapped out in tight blocks, Rehearsals in the morning, meetings in the afternoon, performances in the evening. Scripts arrived faster than he could finish reading them. Phone calls overlapped. Invitations stacked up. The rhythm was relentless, almost intoxicating. He moved from set to stage to studio with the assurance of someone needed, expected, awaited. Now, there are stretches of empty space on the calendar. Not dramatic gaps, just quiet days. Fewer early call times. Fewer late-night rehearsals. The phone rings less urgently. The world no longer demands his presence with the same insistence. It is not rejection. It is simply the natural shifting of seasons. New faces rising, new stories told, the industry turning as it always does. But when the noise fades, what remains can feel heavier than applause ever did. Evenings arrive earlier now. There are nights when the house settles into stillness before 9. No scripts to memorize, no costumes laid out for the next morning. Just the faint hum of distant traffic, perhaps the soft tick of a clock. The television may flicker on for company, but it rarely holds his attention for long. Silence expands in rooms that once echoed with preparation and anticipation. He has family. He has people who care. But even within companionship, there can be a private loneliness that no one else fully sees. It is the loneliness of transition, the distance between who you were and who you are becoming. For a man whose identity was intertwined with movement, physical, emotional, creative, the slowing down can feel unfamiliar. When there are no back-to-back rehearsals, no urgent lines to rehearse, the mind wanders differently. Memories surface more easily. Old performances replay in fragments. He may recall the weight of a costume, the heat of stage lights, the sound of applause rolling toward him like a wave. Memory can be both comfort and burden. There is something profoundly human about sitting in a quiet room and remembering a time when your presence changed the atmosphere of a space, when your entrance altered the energy of an audience, when your voice alone could silence a hall. Now some days pass without that intensity. The world moves on. The spotlight shifts, and the man who once stood in its center must learn to exist outside of it. For many in their middle years and beyond, this transition feels familiar. The body shifts. The pace slows. The roles we play in public evolve or quietly dissolve. Retirement, semi-retirement, reduced workloads, these are not dramatic events. They creep in gradually, disguised as practicality. And with them comes reflection. Fame, as powerful as it once felt, offers no shield against aging joints or persistent fatigue. It cannot negotiate with time. It does not soften the ache in the morning or shorten recovery after exertion. Applause does not echo loudly enough to drown out the body's quiet reminders. This is not tragedy. It is reality. But reality can sting when contrasted with a luminous past. He may sit some evenings with old recordings playing softly. Past interviews, fragments of theater productions, archived moments of triumph. The younger version of himself appears confident, almost invincible. The posture straight, the voice unwavering, the eyes fierce and certain. The man watching now is gentler. His movements are more restrained, his breathing measured. There is depth in his gaze, but also a certain distance, as though he is observing not only the screen, but the passage of time itself. Loneliness after acclaim does not always look like isolation. Sometimes it is simply the absence of urgency, the absence of constant validation, the absence of schedules so full they leave no room for contemplation. And contemplation can be uncomfortable. When the lights dim and the audience disperses, what remains is the self, stripped of costume, stripped of character, stripped of applause. Just a man navigating his own aging body in a quieter world. There is a kind of dignity in that, but also vulnerability. For those in their 40s, 50s, and 60s reading his story, the parallels may feel uncomfortably close. The realization that strength shifts, that careers plateau, that recognition fades, that health, once assumed to be stable, demands attention and patience. He is not alone in this experience, but he may feel alone in certain moments. A quiet evening, a half-finished cup of tea, the echo of laughter from another room, the awareness that time has moved steadily forward, indifferent to reputation. Fame cannot slow it. Legacy cannot reverse it. The body changes anyway. And so he sits sometimes in that stillness, not defeated, not dramatic, just aware. A man who once lived loudly, now learning how to live softly. A man once surrounded by constant movement, now adjusting to slower rhythms. The silence after a life of applause is not empty. It is full of memory, full of contrast, full of questions that do not demand immediate answers. There comes a point, quiet, almost unannounced, when slowing down is no longer a choice, but a conversation. Not a dramatic halt, not a collapse, just a subtle shift in tempo. For years, Sello Maake Ka-Ncube moved as though momentum itself were loyal to him. Projects overlapped. Energy replenished itself overnight. The body answered every demand without hesitation. That phase of life feels almost mythic now, not because it was perfect, but because it felt endless. It wasn't. And that realization does not arrive with fireworks. It comes gently, in the way stairs require more thought, in the way mornings stretch longer before full alertness settles in, the way the body begins to negotiate instead of comply. At 65, he is no longer an emblem standing beneath lights. He is a man waking up in the same body every day, learning its new language. There is something profoundly human about that shift. We spend so much of our younger years believing stamina is permanent, that resilience is part of our identity, that strength defines us. And when that strength softens, it can feel personal, almost like betrayal. But it isn't betrayal, it is rhythm, the same rhythm that governs everything else. Seasons change. Careers crest and ebb. Muscles respond differently. Recovery slows. Not because one has failed, but because the body has kept count. Sello once carried roles that demanded physical command, authority, projection, presence. He embodied men who dominated rooms. Now, he finds himself navigating something less theatrical, but equally profound: acceptance. Not the loud, triumphant acceptance that makes headlines. The quiet kind. The kind that happens when a man looks at his reflection and sees both who he was and who he is now. When he recognizes that the posture may not be as firm, the stride not as quick, the stamina not as reliable, and yet there is still worth in the person standing there. He is no longer just the celebrated actor. He is a 65-year-old man listening carefully to his own body. There is dignity in that listening. The world often celebrates endurance, pushing through pain, defying age. But there is another kind of strength, the strength to slow down without resentment, to adjust expectations without bitterness, to understand that limitation is not humiliation. It is part of being alive long enough to experience it. He does not need to be an icon in his own living room. He does not need applause to validate his breathing. When the lights are off and the curtains closed, there is no audience demanding excellence. There is only the ordinary reality of human aging. And in that ordinariness, he becomes less myth and more man. Perhaps that is the deeper transformation, to move from symbol to self, to realize that legacy can exist independently of daily vitality. That contribution does not evaporate simply because the body slows. That identity can expand beyond performance. For many in midlife and beyond, This is the stage rarely discussed openly. The negotiation between ambition and energy, between memory and muscle, between what one once could do effortlessly and what now requires intention. Slowing down is not surrender. It is adjustment. It is recalibration. There is a kind of wisdom that only emerges when speed diminishes, when one is forced to sit longer, to think more, to choose carefully where to expend energy. In those quieter hours, reflection deepens, perspective sharpens. He may no longer move with the urgency of youth, but there is something steadier now, an awareness that time is not an opponent to defeat, but a companion to understand. The applause may have defined a chapter, but breathing through fatigue defines another. And perhaps this chapter, though less visible, is just as significant. It strips away spectacle. It leaves behind essence. A man confronting his own fragility without theatrics. A man acknowledging that the body sets boundaries he cannot rewrite. There is no shame in that. No tragedy either. Just truth. At 65, Sello Maake Ka-Ncube stands not at the center of a stage, but at the center of his own humanity. No longer required to be towering. No longer obligated to project strength at all times. Just a man, aging as all men do, feeling the weight of mornings, measuring his steps, conserving energy, accepting that the body will not return to what it was. And in that acceptance, there is something unexpectedly powerful. Not the power of dominance, but the power of awareness. To slow down is not to disappear. It is to move differently. And sometimes, moving differently is the quietest, most honest role a person will ever inhabit. Late afternoon settles differently these days. The house is quiet again, but this time the silence feels less heavy, more suspended, like a breath held without urgency. In the living room, near the far wall, there is an empty chair. It is not ornate, just a simple armchair, slightly worn at the edges, the fabric softened by years of use. It faces the window, angled just enough to catch the last of the sun. Across from it, mounted carefully on the wall, hangs a photograph from decades ago. A younger man stares out from the frame, shoulders straight, jaw firm, eyes bright with certainty. The lighting in the photo is theatrical, dramatic. It captures him at a time when the world seemed to move at his pace. That young man is unmistakably Sello Maake Ka-Ncube. But the man sitting in the room now is quieter. He does not look at the photograph immediately. He sits in another chair, a little farther back, hands resting loosely on his thighs. The light from the window cuts across his shoulder at an angle, outlining the curve of his back, tracing the lines time has drawn gently into his face. Nothing dramatic happens. No confession, no final speech, just the slow movement of evening. The empty chair remains untouched. Perhaps it once held scripts. Perhaps it once held guests, conversations, laughter after rehearsals. Now it holds only air and fading sunlight. It is not abandoned. It is simply waiting, like so many things in a house that has known both noise and stillness. On the wall, the younger version of him seems almost suspended in permanence, forever strong, forever lit, forever mid-performance. Photographs are kind that way. They freeze certainty. They do not show the stiffness that comes later. They do not capture the quieter negotiations with the body. The man in the room shifts slightly, not out of discomfort this time, just adjustment. He inhales, slowly. Exhales. His gaze drifts toward the window, not quite toward the photograph. Outside, the sky dims into softer shades, the day folding in on itself without ceremony. It is strange, perhaps, how life rearranges itself. There was a time when evenings meant preparation. Costumes laid out. Lines rehearsed in low murmurs. A certain anticipation humming in the air. Now, Evenings mean something else entirely. Reflection. Rest. A gentle awareness of time passing without applause. But there is no bitterness in his posture, only stillness. The photograph remains on the wall, not as a reminder of loss, but of continuity. That young man was real. The strength was real. The voice, the stage lights, the applause. They were not illusions. They existed. They mattered. And so does this moment. The quiet is not emptiness. It is different from the roar of a theater, but not less significant. It carries its own weight, its own truth. The empty chair catches the last stretch of light before shadows claim it. Dust motes drift lazily through the beam. Nothing urgent, nothing loud, just the quiet choreography of an ordinary evening. He does not rise. He does not reach for the photograph. He simply sits. Perhaps that is the most honest image of all. Not a legend commanding attention, not a public figure addressing an audience, but a man alone with his own breath, his own thoughts, his own aging body. The world outside continues without pause. New actors take stages. New voices rise. New applause swells in distant theaters. Time does what it has always done. Move forward without commentary. Inside the room, the light fades further, softening edges, blurring outlines. The empty chair becomes silhouette. The photograph on the wall loses detail as dusk thickens. And the man remains where he is, shoulders touched by the last slant of sun. No promises hang in the air. No declarations about tomorrow. Just this: a room, a chair, a photograph, and a man seated in the in-between space of memory and present breath. Maybe, at some point in life, the hardest thing is not the slowing down itself. Maybe it is learning to sit within that slower rhythm without arguing with it. And perhaps the real courage is not in holding on to who we were under bright lights, but in allowing ourselves to remain quietly when the light turns softer and falls at an angle across our shoulders.